double duty filming a school play for a friend. Prevented me from doing that. Okay, so basically this lecture is the Progressive Era and World War I, Texas from 1900 to 1919. And basically what we talked about last time is things started off going off pretty good. All of a sudden Texas discovers oil. We've got a brand new future. Meanwhile in America they're trying to make the government an agency of change. We get Teddy Roosevelt elected president, who's very progressive. Here in Texas we have things like labor reform, 16-hour days, illegal to blacklist employees, in company stores, ban child labor. But then it kind of takes a turn for the weird when you start to have this huge movement to disenfranchise the black vote, especially after the Farmers Alliance had been so popular in Texas that it tried to get blacks and whites to join together. And the people who were leading this charge were progressive Democrats. What was the excuse they offered? Basically that it would cause less violence among whites. And the tool they were going to use to disenfranchise blacks was the poll tax, where you had to pay a tax to be able to vote. That had to be paid for back in February, and of course election time wasn't until November, so it gave you plenty of time to lose it. And you can see here, this is an actual Dallas County poll tax receipt from 1915, where it has, name, as occupation, as well as race. Now, is America also taking this racial turn? Well, yeah, America's in transition. Why? Because Teddy Roosevelt, who retired after 2 terms, and he gets tapped, he chooses his running mate. While he's on safaris and everything, he sits back and he thinks about it and he thinks, wait a minute, I didn't actually serve 2 terms because the reason I became president is because the president was assassinated. So he comes back to America, he goes to the Republican Party, and he says, hey, I want to be your candidate again. And the Republican Party said, no, we already have a candidate, and that's Taft, the guy that we're backing. So Teddy Roosevelt goes out, forms his 3rd party, called the Bull Moose Party, goes off on a huge tour with electioneering. Now, did y'all know that cigarettes can save your life? Did y'all know that cigarettes can save your life? Teddy Roosevelt proved it. At one election speech, when he was getting ready to go in to the theater, a guy jumped out of the crowd, shoots him in the chest. The bullet went through like 50 note cards that he had for his speech, went through his glass case, went through his cigarette case, through the cigarettes, went through the other side, but going through all that stuff slowed the bullet down enough so that it barely pierced his skin. And of course he did bleed and everything like that. And everybody was like, let's get you to a hospital. He goes, no, this is great. And he goes up on a stage that night and goes, sorry the meeting's getting off a little late today, but I was shot. And he opens up his jacket and there's the bloody shirt. And the crowd's like, ah! And he goes, it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. And everybody, hey! And how many of y'all would like to see those cards, that he had that got shot through with a bullet hole? Yeah. Well, tough. Good luck trying to get him, because he basically passed him out after the speech so people would remember. Even though there are some museums that do have them. But anyway, he runs and he actually beats Taft in the election. Only problem is, it totally split the Republican vote. So it allows Woodrow Wilson to become president, even though he only got 42% of the popular vote. And Woodrow Wilson's presidency is the first time since the Civil War that a Southern Democrat has been elected president. I mean, he was the president of college, he was an intellectual, he wanted to out Teddy Roosevelt, but in a very intellectual way. Meanwhile, what about Texas? What's it doing through this transition? Well, we have two governors, Thomas Campbell, who did support regulatory measures for industry, and he even tried to get a state income tax passed, which is kind of progressive, but Texas said, no thank you. Oscar Colquitt, he passed laws against child labor, as well as he limited the hours that women could work. But the beginning of his, his term was plagued because in 1910, a revolution breaks out in Mexico against the rule of Porfirio Diaz, and there were occasional raids that did spill off the Mexican border and cross over here into Texas. Well, then we get our next big governor, James Ferguson. And basically he was seen always as the hero of the little guy. He was born in East Texas, and he wanted to limit the amount that owners could charge sharecroppers. Now, some people argue that the only reason why he did that is so the farmers would have money left over to pay for the poll tax so they could elect him. But he was incredibly popular among the poor and common working man. He also provided more funding for the state colleges. He started the State Department of Forestry as well as the Texas Highway Department. And I just remembered I forgot to tell you something about Colquitt. Back here. Colquitt was, before he became governor, he was the president of the University of Texas at Austin. He was very pro-prohibition. And apparently he did meddle in student affairs a lot. And it was because of his reign as president of the University of Texas at Austin, it inspired a satirical song called "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You" all the livelong day, talking about how he, as president of the university, was always looking over, kind of being a moral police, and that became the UT's fight song. Yay, Colquitt. So we got to this one. Now what about Paul Ferguson in the Mexican Revolution? Well, guys, things kind of got really serious underneath Paul Ferguson, because you had found out here in Texas the plan to San Diego that basically was a cry for Tejanos to rise up and take back the lands that had been lost to Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, which caused a lot of concern. Basically, Ferguson sent the Texas Rangers in to take care of it. One of those Texas Rangers was Mike Hammer, a guy who had retired from the Rangers for a year, who they recalled to catch Bonnie and Clyde. And basically Mike Hammer was the guy who found out where they were going to be, all that stuff, and led to their deaths being shot up in the car. Because they had already killed so many cops, they knew it wasn't going to be a peaceful arrest. Well, the Texas Rangers, this problem was so big that just the Rangers themselves could not contain the fight, so the National Guard had to be dispatched down to the border. Paul Ferguson was against women's suffrage. He was also against prohibition. What?
Double check. Is this is different than James Ferguson, right?
Yeah, Paul Ferguson? Paul Ferguson is James Ferguson.
Right.
His nickname was Paul.
Makes no sense.
And I will tell you after the trial why he was nicknamed Paul. Well, he was Paul, and his wife, Miriam, was named Mom. And by the way, his wife was a governor of Texas. Why was she a governor of Texas? Because, I was about to say, he was against prohibition. Then it was found out that he received like $151,000 in bribes from the Brewers Association. And this causes a huge fervor. Hobby, who was the lieutenant governor, who, by the way, did a great job of limiting the power of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas. He really went after, he led the Senate in an impeachment, Paul Ferguson. And they had like, of all the charges they get against him, they focused on 10 that they charged him of. Basically, he was removed from the governorship. And even though he tried to run for governor, Hobby beat him out. And so while he was on the political outs, he basically kept in contact with all his people with something called the Ferguson Papers, where it was kind of like a little, home neighborhood association send these things out to the people that live there.
Flyers?
Yeah, kind of like flyers, just, hey, how's it going? Here's what's going on in the neighborhood. Here's when trash pickup is. The announcements and everything like that. Well, he did that with the Ferguson Papers, putting things that were favorable to him to a lot of people, basically anybody who would accept it, and a lot of poor people did support him. And so his wife, Ma Ferguson, she ran and she won. Even though basically Paul Ferguson told her what to do. She was a female governor here in Texas. Now the term. When progressivism ain't so nice anymore. 1916. What happened in 1916? Wilson is elected our president. And how did Wilson deal with the Mexican Revolution? Well, basically, Wilson was the first guy that we used to have missionary diplomacy. Meaning if a nation called itself an independent and free nation, then we'd recognize it as such. Wilson, however, starts America on moral diplomacy. In other words, we will only recognize you if we agree with who your leaders are. Now, what might be a modern example of our moral diplomacy?
Taiwan and Venezuela.
Huh?
Taiwan and Venezuela.
Well, actually, I think we recognize Taiwan. Venezuela, definitely. Cuba, definitely.
We only recognized Taiwan within the last 2 to 3 years, I think, because we hadn't until the most recent administration. And as for Venezuela, we chose to recognize Guaido instead of Maduro.
Oh, well, there's a whole lot of bad blood with Maduro going back through the presidents when he anyway, that's American history. Anyway, he totally disagreed with Carranza, the person who the people had chosen as leader of Mexico. And by the way, some people point out that it was under Carranza that the plan to San Diego came out in Texas. That definitely did increase the violence along the border. No, excuse me, he didn't like Huerta. Anyway, basically in April 1914 at Tampico, a bunch of American sailors went ashore on shore leave. They got drunk, and the the city police locked them up. Well, when the city commander found out what happened, he immediately released them and said, "Hey, we're so sorry," to the United States, but it was too little, and Wilson didn't want to hear it anyway, because he just wanted an excuse to go to war. So he began a bombardment of Veracruz, which is their top bombardment and blockade of Veracruz, which is their top import port. This basically deprived Huerta of ammunition and guns, and basically allowed the rebel Carranza to take over, who was the guy that Wilson supported. Well, another rebel who had fought with Carranza and now was getting the short stick was Pancho Villa, whose wife lived up here in El Paso. And Villa was infuriated because basically President Wilson was supplying him with ammunition and guns, and Villa was getting nothing. So early at about 5 in the morning in Columbus, New Mexico, which is about 14 miles from the Mexican border, in March, Pancho Villa and about 150 others go to Columbus, New Mexico, shoot up the town, stop the train there that has arms and ammunition, and retreats back into Mexico. This prompts Wilson to launch the Mexican expedition, where he sends more than 7,000 men to find Pancho Villa. This whole thing is led by General John Blackjack Pershing. And you know how Pershing got his nickname Blackjack? Because he once was the commander of a black corps, and so he got the nickname Blackjack. And while it didn't really find Pancho Villa, and like I said, Pancho Villa crossed the border 6 times to El Paso to be with his wife. But it was great training for America in modern warfare. I mean, we had trucks were used to supply troops. We even used planes as scout planes to search for Pancho Villa? And did we push so deep into Mexico that Carranza doesn't like it, even though Wilson doesn't care? And we don't leave the Mexican expedition until 1917, when it looks like things in Europe might get a little bit nasty. And of course it soured relations with America a little. Now, Wilson in World War I. At first, Wilson wanted America to stay neutral, in fact, as well as in name. He basically hoped that Americans could act as the brokers of peace. Now, why did Wilson hope this? Well, because Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, won a Nobel Peace Prize as well as a Medal of Honor. And what did he win his Nobel Peace Prize? Well, President Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for signing a peace agreement between Japan and Russia. And basically Wilson thought that this was his opportunity to get the warring nations of Europe to kind of sit down at the peace table and talk about it. Now, was this a simple thing for Americans? Well, most Americans were for England, but 8 of the 97 million Americans had one or more parents from Germany or Austria, and 5 million were Irish, who held the English in total disdain. And basically pro-British propagandists began to flood out with anti-German propaganda. And of course we try to use tricks like refuse to loan belligerent nations money. In other words, if they run out of money, they won't be able to keep the war going on. But the war did keep going on. So then they changed it to where we'll sell you goods, but you have to use your own ships to carry it back. This, of course, causes submarine warfare, which people were shocked and horrified by, because it was an attack that came just suddenly, with no warning. Now, as you know, they sank the Lusitania, and then Germany was like, hey, it was in the submarine zone, we warned everybody. And by the way, the Lusitania actually was carrying brass shell casings, so it was carrying war material. But the world still da-da-da, and Germany was like, whatever. But then 2 weeks later, they sank another cruise liner, the Sussex, and the world was outraged, and Germany said, okay, our bad. They issued the Sussex Pledge, which says we're not going to do this anymore. But as you know, the war went on and on and on, and Germany felt so close to victory if we could just knock them out. And so it announced unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, which did sink some American merchant vessels. Wilson, of course, was horrified. And then, after 2 of our ships are sunk, England just happens to have had the Zimmerman Telegraph. The Zimmerman Telegraph was a message from Germany to Mexico that, hey, Mexico, if you get involved in the war and attack America, then we'll make sure that you get back all the land you lost. in the Mexican-American War. And of course, when Wilson they handed it to us on like March 31st. And of course, when Wilson finds out, he's shocked and disgusted. And on April 2nd, 1917, he asked Congress for a declaration of war to make the world safe for democracy. In the Senate, 4 voted no, and 88 voted yes. In the House of Representatives, the first female representative, Jeanette Rankin, and 49 others voted no, while 373 voted yes. By the way, Jeanette Rankin is a House of Representative member before nationally women get the right to vote, which is kind of cool. And in December, we also declared war against Austria. By the way, Wilson was incredibly racist. He made sure that the troops were segregated. He was the guy that segregated the government officials and government offices. He's the reason why the Pentagon has the most restrooms for a federal building, because blacks and whites couldn't use the same restrooms for both men and women, so it's just... Well, how does Texas respond to this? Well, Texas has more than 197,789 Texas volunteers that serve in the war. 5,171 ladies serve as nurses. Like 4,900 of those were with the Army. The rest were with the... We got new Army bases like Camp Arthur out in Waco, Camp Logan in Houston, and Camp Bowie out in Fort Worth. Do a great job at building up the economy. And we have new airfields and air stations open up, like Hicks Field, Call Field, and Kelly Field down in San Antonio. And Kelly's weird because it was kind of an Air Force base. It grew into one. But then in the 80s, it was decommissioned, sold to the city, and became like Kelly City Base. Now, of course, civil liberties in the time of war, things got hurt a little bit. Laws were passed against the use of foreign languages. Libraries, even here in Texas, took out German books. Bach and Beethoven are no longer played in some communities. Like in the hill country, they used to have tons of German newspapers, because that was kind of like the German heart of Texas. They stopped publication, because that wasn't considered American. Indeed, it was funny. Once I was Weblow's leader, and on Memorial Day we had to put flags down for the fallen veterans at Sam Houston military base, and we were in the cemetery, and they were putting down flags on the tombstones, and there were like 7 people who had been in America, but there were like 3 German, 2 Italian, 1 Japanese, people of other armies that had died in our prisoner of war camps. So we couldn't let the kids put flags on those. So this one scout was walking by with his mom, and I was like, hey, don't, just keep going, you can't put flags on these. And I'm like, why? And I said, well, because they were foreign soldiers, like we got 3 German. I told him what I just told you. And the kid goes, Germans, I hate Germans. And his mom leans down and goes, honey, we're German. So I thought that was funny. But that's kind of indicative of what happened during this time. If you were German, it wasn't cool. I mean, they changed names of like sauerkraut to Liberty cabbage. Hot dogs were called Liberty dogs, Victory dogs, excuse me. German measles were Liberty measles. And guys, this happened probably just a bit shy from when y'all were walking the earth. But there once was a time when Gaddafi had blown up a discotheque, killing some American troops there. So we wanted to launch a reprisal raid, which we did from the USS Enterprise. But France wouldn't let us use their airspace for our bombers. Well, we were kind of mad about that. So we wanted to change the name of French toast to like Victory toast, French fries to Victory fries. I mean, it never caught on, but that's the exact same kind of thing that America was going through at that time. You had the Espionage Act passed in 1917, the Sedition Act in 1918, that limited speech. Members of the International Workers of the World, that union that was started by Eugene Debs, were arrested with very little evidence except their danger to the United States. And in response to this is where you see the rise of the Civil Liberties Bureau, which was a forerunner of the ACLU. This here is an example of some of the anti-German propaganda. Destroy this mad brute. You see, he's kind of like a gorilla. Got a fainting woman in his arms. There on his hand, he's carrying a club called Culture that's all bloody. Why do we have propaganda like that? Why do we depict the enemy as, like apes?
Dehumanizes them?
Yeah, dehumanize, because it's tough to kill a human. It's easy to kill an ape.
Now what you see is the uniform, because you also notice the German helmet on his head.
Yeah, he's got the German helmet on his head, a little Kaiser top up there. Meanwhile, during this time, you did have a woman since like 1905. Annette Finnegan and her sisters Catherine and Elizabeth are fighting to get liquor stopped here in Texas. They first formed the Equal Suffrage League of Houston, of course, which was anti-alcohol. But like 2 years after they started it, Annette and her sisters leave Texas. When they leave Texas, the group loses all leadership, totally flounders. By April of 1913, she's back. And they start the Texas Women's Suffrage Association. And they did make some headway. Like Dallas, there were tons of counties in Texas that were dry. And there still are some dry counties in Texas. Now, what's a dry county?
Where alcohol is illegal?
Where it's illegal. Where you can't, in a dry county, you can't have it. They still have a lot of those, especially in East Texas. And like I said, Dallas used to be a dry county. And in 1919, Texas was the first southern state to ratify the 19th Amendment, also known as the Volstead Act, that made illegal the manufacture or distribution of liquor. So they, along with the Methodists and Baptists in particular, those two religious groups, were successful. By 1910, blacks were 18% of the population. Of course, they had to live in segregated schools. The first county in the U.S. that actually had segregated neighborhoods was the city of Dallas, with the Kessler Plan, which they passed in 1916. That basically said these are the white neighborhoods, these are the black neighborhoods, these are the Hispanic, well, they didn't say these are the Hispanic neighborhoods. Which of course made Hispanics say, we're white, we want to be with the white neighborhoods. Now, why did that happen in Dallas? Well, what they did was they said, basically Dallas was led by big businessmen, and basically big businessmen thought this would make the workers happier, make them more productive. Oh, and by the way, according to the Kessler Plan, if you lived in a neighborhood, like if you lived in a white neighborhood, and you wanted to change your designation to like mixed, you could do that. You'd have to have a popular vote, where the majority in that neighborhood decided, yeah, we're going to be a mixed neighborhood now. But you could change. Meanwhile, it should also come as no surprise that race riots took place during this, with one breaking out in Houston in 1917. Here's some of the black officers, and by the way, the guy who was the leader of the troops out at Fort Travis and Fort Houston, Schuyler Marshall, would later become a sheriff of Dallas, that fought tooth and nail to prevent two black guys from getting taken out and lynched. We had just completed our new city jail. The crowd numbered anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000, depending on which newspaper you read. So let's call it 7,500, who were like taking shots, everything like that. And they only had like 250 other police officers. Anyway, they prevented two black guys from getting lynched by the mob. He had come back to Dallas because his brother was sick. The weekend he came home, Fort Travis was in a white section of Houston that did not like the fact that they had an army base with colored soldiers. One colored soldier was off base. He was stopped by a police officer, questioned, and taken into the jail. Well, this made the officers infuriated, so they, about 6 of the officers go to the jail to find out what's going on. They can't find him. They then go back to the base. Rumors start going around that a white mob is getting ready to march on them. So they take all the rifles, everything like that, and basically they arm themselves. Here they are marching down the street. Okay? Well, eventually, white mob does show up. There's a shootout. 16 get killed, 22 injured from the riot. Skylar Marshall is charged back to command of his troops. And there's like all of the colored soldiers who participated in this were executed. And later, Skylar Marshall took these troops that were purposed to go to World War I. Instead, went out to New Mexico and did some environmental reconstruction and helping out. The next one happened in Longview in 1919. It was part of what was known as the Red Summer, where basically in places like, you had race riots breaking out all over in America. You had hundreds of blacks killed during this, and I don't know how many whites. Anyway, in Longview, apparently, there was a black gentleman who was rumored to be having improper relations with a white woman. They go, a white mob goes to ask him about it. He, of course, locks his doors, has little rifles. The white mob goes back, gets their rifles. They come back to the house. They find the house abandoned, so they burn it down. When they do find them, they basically lynch them, which of course causes the nearby blacks to rise up against them. But it was messy business. Meanwhile, Tejanos, guys, there were about 250,000 Tejanos, mainly in South Texas during this time. And we saw a rapid increase of Tejanos, especially those that were being motivated by the Texas Revolution, by the Mexican Revolution, to get out of Mexico. An excellent example of that is Francisco Pancho Medrano. There's a picture of him as a boxer. Basically, his family fled Mexico during the Revolution, walking all the way from, I can't think of the name. It's on the eastern coast. It's not Veracruz. Anyway, walking all the way from there to San Antonio. Then a year later, walking from San Antonio to Texas. Pancho Medrano was born, I believe, in San Antonio. He was up here with his family in Texas. The neighborhood where they lived was basically called Little Mexico because of its high Hispanic population. And that section now is near where Uptown is. Anyway, he recalls when he was about 5 years old, so that would be sometime about 1922. One day his father was questioned by police, taken into the police station, and they never heard from his father again. Ann Richards, when she was governor, said she was going to examine that case, but I'm not certain whatever came of it. Anyway, he really brings awareness to the Tejano community. He takes on the Texas Rangers and he wins. And a big deal in Dallas breaks out in 1970 that he's pivotal behind. And basically he starts a very strong political family, and members of his family, one of them is now an alderman in the city government. I've actually met him, he's a nice guy. He represents the area near Farmers Market. You know, where they got all the real nice housing down in downtown now? Yeah, that's his area, and it trails off a little too. All right, Prohibition. Well, like we said, Prohibition's been struggling here since 1887. You know, I already told you, you have dry counties, you got wet counties. By the Progressive period, they formed the Texas Local Option Association, trying to get more and more people to quit drinking. Once again, they're fully supported by the Methodists and Baptists. And a lot of the progressives believe that drunkenness was bad. They celebrate once the Volstead Act or Prohibition is passed, which of course really hurt a lot of German brewers as well as others here in Texas. So what kind of brings everything back to a calm? Well, by 1920, Americans are just tired. They've been at war, they've been through all of this rapid changes. At first they might have liked it like with Teddy, but in World War I, the Texas government, the government of the United States has never been in more control of its people than during World War I. And kind of the bombastic moralism of Wilson, they decide to vote for Warren G. Harding, whose election pledges that he's going to return America to normalcy, whatever normalcy means, because it isn't even a word. But apparently it was good enough for the American people, and the Progressive era symphony. All right, so be on the lookout tomorrow for what's going to be on your quiz.